Welcome everyone, it's great to have you with us. This afternoon we will be joining Will Cooling on the subject of LGBT plus equality then and now. If you have any questions for Will, pop them in the Q&A box and he'll go through them at the end of the talk. Just a reminder, this session is being recorded, so please don't share any confidential information as it is a public platform. Welcome Will, over to you.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome everybody. As I said, my name is Will Calling. I'm Head of Equality and Diversity. My pronouns are he, him, and I am also a bisexual man. So this is a bit of the kind of history, the stuff that predated me and the stuff that came after me, because I am 35. So I'm kind of an interesting point in the sense of my coming of age when I realized I was bisexual was kind of midway through the kind of long evolution of LGBT rights here in the UK, starting in the 1960s. So in terms of our talk today, what I want to talk about is just the key milestones to legal LGBT plus equality, kind of talk about the cultural and political context behind these issues and the outstanding issues we face today. So reason as to why it's there, my apologies. But first of all, I'm going to start with hopefully a simple question, which is, when did male homosexuality become legal across the UK? Now, we say male homosexuality because famously the law that criminalised male homosexuality that was passed in the Victorian era did not mention female homosexuality. It only made male homosexuality illegal. Now, the myth, the kind of myth of this story was Queen Victoria refused to have any mention of female homosexuality in a law because she thought the very concept was unfathomable. I think most people now recognize that wasn't true, that basically they just couldn't work out how to define lesbian homosexuality in law, and so they just went with criminalizing male homosexuality. And indeed, you don't actually get things like an age of consent for homosexual acts between women until this century, just because they couldn't work out how to define this in law, unbelievably so. But yeah, so quick question, so just post your answers in the chat. When did male homosexuality become legal across the UK? Was it 1967? Or was it 1980? Or was it 1982? I'll just give it a few seconds, time people pop that into the chat. Is there any advance on 1967 from Rich? No. 1967 is the wrong answer. This is a bit of a trick question because the actual answer is 1982. Because 1967 is when male homosexuality was legalised in England and Wales, but Scotland and Northern Ireland actually took longer. Scotland legalised homosexuality in 1980, and then Northern Ireland legalised it in 1982. Now, this is kind of strange because obviously this is the era before Scottish devolution. It straddles the era where Northern Ireland ceased to have its own parliament. So it was Westminster passing the laws to legalise homosexuality in Scotland and Northern Ireland. They just chose to do it later than in England and Wales. The argument in both cases was that Scotland and Northern Ireland were basically more religious than England and Wales, both countries obviously being primarily Presbyterian in terms of their Protestant religion, compared to England and Wales is Anglican or other nonconformists, and also, of course, with large Catholic communities. So that was the argument that was put forward at the time. It actually was only under the threat of repeated judgments against the British government in the European Court of Human Rights that they finally agreed to legalise male homosexuality across the entirety of the UK. So to place that in context, 1982, that was 3 years before I was born, when male homosexuality stopped being de jure illegal in the UK. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that actually that is less of a breakthrough than it can sometimes seem, because the way we had the unfortunate reaction to the legalization of male homosexuality, that in the 70s and particularly in the 80s, you had a growing inclination of cops, of police officers, to arrest men under general laws of gross indecency if they thought they were homosexuals. Famously, you would have undercover police officers going into gay clubs, outside gay clubs, and trying to tempt, to trick men to make a pass at them, to come on to them, so they would then be able to arrest them under these gross indecency laws. And you had hundreds, if not thousands, of men that were persecuted this way. Just a bit about the legalization of male homosexuality in England and Wales back in 1967. It's part of an interesting period of history in the sense of obviously the law had been on the books since the Victorian era, but it's the it the how strongly it was enforced did ebb and flow from that period. But what you had in the 40s and 50s was a growing fear of male homosexuality. It linked to the various high-profile cases of defectors to the Soviet Union being gay men working in the civil service. And one of the arguments for male homosexuality was not that it was part of a move towards gay equality. Indeed, um, those trying to reform the law had to kind of pretend that that wasn't what they wanted, because that would concern people who did not agree with gay equality. But actually, one of the arguments was that the law had become a blackmailer's charter. That by having male homosexuality be illegal, even if you didn't think male homosexuality was a good thing, you were making it very easy for people to be blackmailed, which meant that actually you were creating an issue for national security, but also for other people's private lives. I think a good illustration of where the kind of debate when it came to gay equality was in England and Wales in the 60s is the famous film Victim, which is all about a man's life being ruined as he's blackmailed due to being a homosexual. So, as an important mark, the legalization of male homosexuality, but does take a while to spread across the entire UK. And also, it is slightly undone by the fact that the police do quite aggressively still go after gay men through the use of agent provocateurs. Obviously, one of the things you may have heard of is Section 28, and this was an amendment to laws governing local government. So what you basically had throughout the 80s was a growing movement to try and teach young people about homosexuality, a growing recognition that many gay people had families of their own, had children, and that more had to be done to kind of help those children understand their place in the world and how their family life fits into society. And this created a huge backlash and moral panic. It was very much one of the original Looney Left stories. And so you had repeated attempts to amend local government law, which was finally successful in 1988, to ban Section 28, to ban the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities through what was called Section 28. As I mentioned, there was a special emphasis on preventing schools teaching that homosexuality was acceptable in family life, but it was broader. There were things such as local authorities not being willing to offer housing to lesbian or gay couples because they were concerned that that would be a legal promotion of homosexuality as a lifestyle. And it just had a tremendous chilling effect on lesbian, gay, bi life throughout the UK. I remember when I came out to a school teacher, and this would be in the late 90s, the school teacher was like, I'm not sure how much I can say to you and support you because, because of Section 28, we're not allowed to promote homosexuality. And this actually caused a huge uproar when it was passed. It led to creation of Stonewall, which is the UK's leading LGBT advocacy organization. The actor Ian McKellen came out, and I think if you squint, You can see him at the front of that march as part of the campaign to try and stop this becoming the law of the land. The key thing I think that can't be underestimated about Section 28 was just how blunt and explicit it was. This wasn't put in code, it wasn't put in euphemism, it wasn't saying, local authorities are held to promote the normal, traditional, ordinary family life. This was quite explicit. This is, you cannot promote homosexuality. And it did create tremendous damage and mental scarring for LGBT people across the UK. Another thing that obviously was a huge problem during the 80s and afterwards was the AIDS pandemic. We're not going to talk about this in too much detail, but obviously, just as a brief overview, you have in the late 70s, early 80s, whispers, rumors about young gay men, sexually active gay men dying of a mystery illness. At one point, its actual name was, gay immunity deficient syndrome. Before, people suggested that maybe you don't have such a homophobic name for a disease. And it created tremendous sense of fear, both within the community, but also outside the community, where people became concerned that any contact with a gay person, with a person with AIDS, meant that they would automatically catch it. And it obviously undid a lot of the kind of sense of momentum and positivity that came from decriminalisation in England and Wales. It turbocharged the kind of moral backlash from elements within society against homosexuality. For those who follow American politics, you may have heard of the broadcaster Rush Limbaugh, who died yesterday. He would literally announce those who had died of AIDS whilst playing a disco song entitled "They'll Never Love That Way Again," using people's deaths from AIDS to make homophobic jokes. The Mail on Sunday writer Peter Hitchens, as late as the 90s, was asking, if we say that people who get lung cancer should never have picked up smoking, why can't we say that people who get AIDS shouldn't have picked up gay sex? So it obviously unleashed tremendous pain on gay people who are dying from the disease. It unleashed tremendous pain due to the moral backlash and bigotry it encouraged. And then there was just the fact that this was an area where it was forcing gay people to rely on a state that was very uncomfortable and very ignorant of their needs. And famously, whilst our in the UK's reaction to AIDS was not good, we were actually one of the countries that did best at handling it. And one of the reasons is we did do the mass advertising campaign, which this image is taken from, the "Don't Die of Ignorance," the big tombstone being chiseled out on the BBC. And the Secretary of State who helped develop this publicity campaign, who had it authorized, Norman Fowler, the then Secretary of State for Health, who is now the Lord Speaker. So it tells you how long his career has been. He's talked about, he had the most awful arguments with Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, who just did not want to have said on the BBC, did not want to have to say it herself, things about gay sex, anal sex, about AIDS, that, again, they were so blunt about their homophobia, but they wanted to try and talk about this in euphemism. And actually, luckily, that didn't happen with the publicity campaign, and it did mean we were able to start turning a corner on the AIDS pandemic through greater awareness of safe sex, of testing, and obviously in the following years, we then started to make progress in terms of medical treatments. But yes, I mean, I would, of course, highly recommend, if you haven't already, watching It's a Sin, the new Russell T Davies drama series set in the 80s. I think it captures the feel and the experiences of people at that time. A lot of it's based on real life. So there is a prolonged scene of one of the characters being basically locked up in isolation for a prolonged period, which is absolutely based on a real life story. That there was instances of local authorities when they got their first AIDS patient turning around and putting people in solitary confinement for days, if not weeks on end, citing public health laws. So yes, a very scary time, both due to the health consequences, but also the homophobia it further unleashed. So obviously that was the 80s, and we come into the 90s, and we have new momentum. We get what is basically a big thrust of liberalisation when it comes to gay rights. But it's basically ushered in with the new Labour government. And one of the curious things about this is it's a very overlooked element of that Labour government record. I think often, even someone like Tony Blair can talk about how his was the new Labour government, that his was the Labour Party that got away from the loony left, that got away from being too obsessed with human rights, and did what ordinary people wanted and focus on bread and butter issues. And even here, this is from the website They Work for You. Even here, this will kind of talk and quite passionately that Tony Blair generally voted for equal gay rights, but I don't think anybody would think of it as core to his political project. But then when you actually look through what that Labour government did, it's like night and day the situation they inherited in 1997 and the one they left in 2010. However, before we talk about that, I just need to talk about the Soho Pub Bombings. I don't know if anybody remembers these, but this was a nail bombing campaign in the late 90s, 99, by a London neo-Nazi that was very much aimed at the London's LGBT community, its Bengali community. And I think one of the really interesting things about this bombing campaign is not just, just another illustration that actually there was significant homophobia in British society, violent homophobia in British society, as late as the late 90s. But also, actually, this is a really key step in the evolution of how the British state treats LGBT people. I remember years ago reading an article based on experiences of the Metropolitan Police supporting people whose partners had been killed or injured in this bombing campaign, and they realized they just had no way of talking to LGBT plus couples, of consoling people who were going through the grieving bereavement process, and they just could not offer the same service to same-sex couples that they do to heterosexual couples. And that led them to actually start thinking more seriously about how they made the service they offered the community genuinely LGBT inclusive. And all sorts of changes were put in place in terms of how they support LGBT victims of crime or the family members of LGBT victims of crime. And actually, from a horrific, violent act came an awful lot of good that did help shape the way the state interacts with people moving forward. But yes, but let's go through the big list of what New Labour did. So first of all, one of the odd things that they inherited was that we had basically half of our current Equality Act framework in place. That in 97 it was illegal to discriminate against somebody based on sex. It had been since the 1960s. It was illegal to discriminate against anybody on the basis of race. It had been since the 70s. It was illegal to discriminate against anybody on the grounds of disability. It had been since the 90s. But actually, sexual orientation, gender identity, whether you're trans or cisgender, religion, these were all left unprotected from discrimination. And so in 99, they extended the Sex Discrimination Act to protect trans people. And then in 2003, they extended general protections against discrimination to cover LGBT people, to protect people against discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation. The age of consent was equalised in 2001. You had throughout, since legalisation of male homosexuality, you had always had a higher age of consent for homosexual sex than you had for heterosexual sex. That had typically been between 2 or 3 years more. So when they last lowered the age of consent in 1994, where the heterosexual age of consent was lowered to 16, they lowered the homosexual age of consent to 18. Because previously it'd been heterosexual sex, the age of consent was 18, and the homosexual age of consent was 21. So they were happy to lower the age of consent, but they still wanted that differential to be in place. The argument being that was to protect children, in inverted commas. But obviously, as anybody knows, the way the Sexual Offences Act works, the way the law on sex works now, there were separate protections to stop, teachers having sex with their students, other people in a position of trust having sex with their charges. So that was always a completely red herring. It was an attempt just to kind of make clear which group was acceptable and which wasn't. So that equalisation happened in 2001. Section 28 was finally abolished in 2003, which meant I had 1 year of schooling when it wasn't in place. You may be wondering that it took the New Labour quite a long time to get round to both of these, considering how big their majority was in the 97 Parliament. And the issue was, in both of these instances, the House of Lords basically used its powers to kind of frustrate the House of Commons, to slow down this process. I believe I'm remembering rightly that in the case of Section 28, they did ultimately have to use a Parliament Act to force the House of Lords to accede to the abolition of Section 28. We will throughout this presentation talk about how Scotland's a bit later than England and Wales when it comes to most of these LGBT equality milestones. This is the only one where Scotland was ahead of England and Wales, because Scotland, because they didn't have to deal with the House of Lords, with their new default parliament, they were able to abolish Section 28 in 2000. We've already mentioned about the discrimination laws being changed. We also had in 2003, though, for the first time a legal process to formally change gender. So obviously, that you had been able to get to have your gender reassignment surgery in the UK for quite some time, but there was no way of actually recognizing the reassigned gender in law until you had the Gender Recognition Act of 2003, which basically outlines, the process someone goes through to have their gender recognized as what it is. And we'll come back to that later, because it has now become an area of controversy through a new lens. We then get in 2005 same-sex civil partnerships. This was for the whole of the UK. So Scotland agreed for Westminster to pass the law on their behalf. One of the interesting things, and we'll talk about this a bit when we get on to gay marriage, how civil partnership should work in practice was one of these areas of quite interesting debate within the LGBT community. There was concern about replicating a heteronormative, patriarchal system that some people felt marriage was. There was some interest in trying to use this as a way of having like a range of different civil partnerships to recognize different types of relationships. But the innate conservatism of that Labour government, I think, won out, and they just went with something that was basically marriage, except in a few key areas. And then finally, this whirlwind of activity, you do get same-sex couples being legally able to adopt in 2005 in England and Wales. Previously, gay people had been able to adopt, but they couldn't adopt as a couple. So say if I was in a relationship with a man and we wanted to adopt, I could have adopted, they could have adopted, we couldn't adopt together, which of course creates all sorts of issues if anything happens to the legal parent in terms of what then happens to the children. But this was for the first time couples could adopt and have both recognized as parents. That takes a while to filter through to the rest of the UK. It's not till 2009 you get same-sex adoption in Scotland, and it's only after a couple of after the Northern Ireland Executive has lost several court cases do you get same-sex adoption in Northern Ireland in 2013. A coda to the question of same-sex adoption is in 2006, the Labour government actually bans adoption services from excluded gay couples, same-sex couples, from their adoption registers. So adoption services that are operating in England and Wales, and I believe all of the UK now, have to offer children up for adoption to all types of couples, not just heterosexual ones. So as you can see, that is a tremendous list of progress. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, within the space of 12 years, you had more progress towards LGBT equality than you'd had since the initial legalization in 1967. A huge wave of progress, but it did leave one thing, which was picked up by the next government, which was same-sex marriage. And it's worth just talking, before we talk about how it became legal in the UK, it is worth talking about the historic framework of this, because this was a controversial idea within the LGBT community. I remember, I think when as a very geeky 14-year-old, I remember picking up a copy of the New Statesman, and you had Peter Tatchell arguing against the idea. It's first being picked up as a major cause in Britain or America was by a conservative journalist called Andrew Sullivan, writing in the New Republic in 1989. And one of the reasons it was so controversial was this idea of, is the LGBT rights movement a way of trying to change society, to make society more diverse, more equal, or is it a way of getting LGBT people fully included in society as it already is? And I think a lot of people, particularly queer theorists, would say that kind of focusing on getting same-sex marriage was very much settling for the latter. It's about us us who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, getting the same rights and access to society as everybody else, rather than trying to change society from the ground up. However, the issues that that not having access to civil partnerships and marriage created had been exposed, particularly in the 80s, particularly as LGBT people started to live more public lives. We mentioned before the issue that were raised by how adoptions used to be worked. One of the issues you had repeatedly is you may have had a gay couple, a same-sex couple with children, but if the kind of parent on the birth certificate fell ill, or the adoption forms fell ill, or became under control of their parents, the other parent, their partner, would lose all access. This became a big issue during the AIDS pandemic, where you would have gay men who would basically almost be, I wouldn't say kidnapped by their parents, but they would become ill. Their parents would start acting as their attorney for their medical decisions, and the partner would be excluded from seeing them in hospital, excluded from funerals. Their access to their house or the estate after death would be challenged and usually rejected. And so the lack of protection that marriage gave, that the lack of same-sex marriage gave people, became very clear. And so in 2014, the coalition government introduced legalized same-sex marriage. It was an interesting one in the sense of David Cameron had advocated for same-sex marriage as leader of the opposition. It was in the government's manifesto, but it actually only passed due to Labour votes because the Tory party split quite badly on the issue. Scotland followed in the same year. So we had same-sex marriages in Great Britain from late 2014. However, same-sex marriages only came to Northern Ireland in last year, and that was part of the period when Northern Ireland was effectively being directly ruled by Westminster, and backbench MPs led by Stella Creasy, Labour MP, was able to actually force the Theresa May's government to legislate for same-sex marriage. So now, finally, we have same-sex marriage across the UK. So in terms of big issues now, I think in terms of the legal framework, the main one is probably concerning trans rights. So as I said, we mentioned we'd come back to the kind of recognition process of gender reassignment. As outlined by the Gender Recognition Act of 2003, you can get a gender recognition certificate that says, that recognizes that you are trans, that your gender was misassigned at birth. As part of that, you also get an amended birth certificate that changes your literal birth certificate, keeps all the details the same, except it changes your gender to what it should be. But the process that outlined was living in your gender for a couple of years, being evaluated by a panel of doctors, undergoing surgical transition, and only then can you have your gender recognition certificate and your amended birth certificate. And the problem with that is, one, there is no provision for non-binary gender identities. The Gender Recognition Act only recognizes M to F or F to M transition. No, primarily just because of the era it was written in. That was before we had such a deep understanding and acceptance of non-binary gender identities. And also it has a strong emphasis on that surgical transition, not understanding that that's not the right type of transition for everybody. Some people may need a medical transition, but they may not need a surgical one. Their gender dysphoria can be handled through medication. Some may not even need a medical transition. They just need to be allowed to affirm their sense of their gender in a social way. And then, of course, when you get onto non-binary gender identities, the type of surgical interventions that are necessary may be different. So there is an ongoing need for the Gender Recognition Act to be changed to reflect those issues. And in addition to that, there is then the debate about whether people should be allowed to self-ID or affirm their gender identity. So actually, do you need a panel of doctors to pass judgment on whether somebody is actually trans, has actually undergone gender transition? Can we not just let people do that themselves? And that has become very controversial. But I think a key thing to remember is that the kind of the contemporary debate where it pits trans rights versus the rights of cisgender women, and particularly when it comes to self-ID, completely overlooks the way the Equality Act works. In the sense of it allows organizations to limit access to jobs, to activities, to services, if they can prove a legitimate need based on one of the Equality Act's protected characteristics. So there is nothing that self-ID would change, that would stop an organization limiting a service or an activity to cisgender women if they legitimately need to do that. In the same way, there's nothing in the Equality Act that stops the Catholic Church limiting who gets to be Pope to Catholics. It goes back to that thing of, can you prove that need? And in in the modern day, you do have jobs, particularly things like support workers and domestic abuse shelters, that are limited to women, are limited to cisgender women. But again, you have to be able to prove that need. Same with sports, you have to be able to prove that need. And I think sometimes people are looking for a shortcut because they kind of deep down know they may not actually have the evidence base to prove that need to be exclusionary. But before I go into that, the other thing I'll just say more generally is I do think kind of getting the Gender Recognition Act is like the last thing in terms of legal LGBT equality that needs to be fine-tuned in the UK. What you're looking at now, the agenda is much more in outcomes, in lifestyle, in esteem. So, are LGBT people reflected properly in media? Are LGBT voices heard within government? No, there has been a big improvement in that level. Even conservative governments tend to have several prominent LGBT figures nowadays. But also just the outcomes. And even today, LGBT people are less likely to be in good mental health. They're more likely to have substance abuse issues, and they're less likely to have a good job. So whilst I think we've got there when it comes to LGBT, in terms of legal equality, with the one exception of the Gender Recognition Act being a bit out of date, there's still much more work to do in terms of how we support people. And indeed, when it comes to trans equality, one of the really big issues is just lack of funding for the NHS's gender recognition services and the various support services for people undergoing gender transition. So finally, thank you for coming today and taking part in LGBT History Month. I hope in your schools, next year, you do try and do stuff in February for LGBT History Month, whether it's film screenings, whether it's talks about key LGBT historical figures, whether it's talking about the evolution of LGBT equality within the UK. If I would make one plea, though, it's just for you to remember that there is no such thing as Pride Month in the UK. This has snuck in these past couple of years from the States. In the States, it's a perfectly valid thing. They don't tend to celebrate LGBT History Month the same way we do. For the one thing, February is their Black History Month. Pride Month is kind of their equivalent to LGBT History Month. It's linked to when the Stonewall riots happened in the 60s. It was first promulgated by Bill Clinton and reaffirmed by Barack Obama. But the reality is, in Britain, we don't have a culture of Pride only happening in June. Birmingham Pride, where this photo is taken from, always happens in May. Manchester Pride always happens in August. When we're able to organise one, Wolverhampton Pride tends to take place in September, October. There's just a broad, London Pride takes place in July usually. There's just a broad range of prides, not just big cities, but small towns as well. So what I'd always urge is, don't just kind of take June as Pride Month. Find out when Pride is taking place locally to you, and then try and support it. If you can offer some funding, that would be great. If you can promote the event to your staff and students, and if you can offer to run a stall promoting your schools and the fact that you're LGBT inclusive, it all helps. Visibility is really important. And even today, a lot of LGBT people, particularly young LGBT people, can feel nervous about expressing their sexuality or gender identity in public, and prides are a unique opportunity to do that. So yes, I'll take any questions if anybody has any. Are there any questions? Just feel free to pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. So Rich asks, can you comment on on the use of the term LGBT? Yes, I can indeed. So the reality is obviously there's a range of groups of people covered by the LGBT umbrella. So you have lesbians, gay people. Traditionally would think of gay men, although there are a lot of women who call themselves gay women now, and bisexuals, and then trans people. I mean, the arguments against the term are twofold. One, is it inclusive enough? So, you know, you do have people who aren't cisgender, aren't straight, but wouldn't necessarily call themselves lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. And I know, you know, I've known groups getting to like when they've got like 8 or 9 initials because they've added queer, they've added undefined, they've added questioning, they've added asexual, autosexual. You know, the list goes on, and it becomes a bit unmanageable. And which is why I think the compromise most have came up with is the LGBT plus. You actually have, as part of that, you also have to debate over queer. My personal belief is I don't have a problem with it myself. But queer can be quite controversial within the LGBT community. When I was a student, I was involved in NUS LGBT, and there would be furious arguments about whether queer should be incorporated into its name. Some people very keen for it to be included, some very keen for it not to be. The argument of people against including queer is basically you can't reclaim a word that was only ever used as an insult, and that they personally find it offensive. I think the broader issue is so to me, because there is that debate, I typically don't include it. I go the LGBT plus, but yes, some people would also add the Q. But then the issue you have, kind of leaving all that thing to one side, is how useful is an umbrella term? Does it actually obscure differences between the constituent groups? And obviously, yes, if you use it in too blunt a way, if you use it in too indiscriminate a way, it can. You know, I'm a bisexual man. I've suffered biphobia from straight people. I've suffered biphobia from gay people too. You know, greedy, you're gonna leave me for a woman, etc., etc. But I think the reality is, whilst you have to be careful, no one is LGBT. An individual is one or more of those individual identities, and you have to talk about, when you talk about individual, you have to talk about their particular issues, experiences. Clearly, there's a big intersection between the issues that lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, trans people all face. And we're stronger when we work together to kind of counteract them. And I think that, and I think that's true even if you say, are there those intersections between LGB and T people? I think there absolutely are. I think you're starting to see that some of this activism about trying to stop trans people using the toilets of their gender starts actually rebounding against other women who don't conform to heteronormative traditional perceptions of what a woman is. So yes, like every umbrella term, you have to be careful how you use it. There are particular issues with what is the correct term to use, because there are debates within the LGBT plus community, but I think it is a useful term. Let's see if there's any other questions there. No, so we've got another question in the chat. Do you think there is lots more work to be done around understanding and acceptance of the LGBT plus community? Yeah, and I think there always is. I think the issue you always have is how big is that community? How permanent is that community? So there's some interesting polling. I think it was Ipsos Mori or YouGov did this week, that was tracking kind of the proportion of the population that is not entirely heterosexual. So I know some is either mostly or entirely attracted to the same sex, or is attracted equally to both sexes. And you can see the increase as people became more open and more used to tolerance and acceptance. I think the key things are, how do we teach history? How do we ensure that we're teaching British LGBT history? There's always a danger with all this stuff that you kind of, the easy thing to do is to kind of lean on what the Americans are doing and what Hollywood is putting out, and you forget to look at our own history. So I once worked at Birmingham Guild of Students, and they had a Harvey Milk room, and sure, I love the Milk movie. I love the assassination of Harvey Milk, but he was a city councillor in San Francisco. We had MPs who were coming out as gay in the 70s and 80s. Maureen Coughlin, who died